praise to the Father, sing praise to the Son, sing praise to the Spirit, our God three in one. Let all the people praise the name of the Lord. Sing praise to the Father, sing praise to the Son, sing praise to the Spirit, our God three in one. Let all the people praise the name of the Lord. All voices and instruments praising together, the people are many, the body is one. In singing and dancing, in writing and painting, one in the Spirit, the old and the young. Sing praise to the Father, sing praise to the Son, to the Spirit, our God three in one. Let all the people praise the name of the Lord. The Lord has been faithful to all generations, walking beside us through smoke and through flame, in sunshine and shadow, protecting, providing, all times and seasons, ever the same. Oh God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come, our shelter from the stormy blast, and our eternal home. Oh God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come, our shelter from the stormy blast, and our eternal all praise to the Father, all praise to the Son, all praise to the Spirit, our God three in one. Let all the people praise the name of the Lord. All praise to the Father, sing praise to the Son, to the Spirit, our God three in one. Let all the people praise. Let all the people praise. Let all the people praise the name of the Lord, 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 the name of the
Good morning, church. A reading from the Gospel of Mark. Hear what God's Spirit is saying to you. Now, after he rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, from whom he had cast out 7 demons. She went out and told those who had been with him while they were mourning and weeping. But when they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they would not believe it. After this, he appeared in another form to 2 of them as they were walking into the country. And they went back and told the rest, but they did not believe them. Later, he appeared to the 11 themselves as they were sitting at the table, and he upbraided them for their lack of faith and stubbornness, because they did not believe those who had seen him after he had risen. And he said to them, "Go into the world and proclaim the good news to the whole creation. The one who believes and is baptized will be saved, but the one who does not believe will be condemned. And those signs will accompany those who believe. By using my name, they will cast out demons. They will speak in new tongues. They will pick up snakes in their hands, and if they drink any deadly thing, it will hurt them. They will lay their hands on the sick, and they will recover." So then the Lord Jesus, after he had spoken to them, was taken up to the heaven and sat at the right hand of God. And they went out and proclaimed the good news everywhere, while the Lord worked with them and confirmed the message by the signs that accompanied it. Here ends the reading of the words that give us insight on God. May God grant us wisdom for courage and interpretation.
Friends, this Lent, we explored who killed Jesus.
Many people were convinced that he killed him.
But we gathered 16 suspects as we retraced the events of Holy Week in a special 6-week podcast.
And with your help, we discovered who really killed Jesus.
This podcast was a production of ProgressiveChristianity.org
And University Christian Church, San Diego.
Give yourselves a round of applause. Friends, I'm Caleb Lyons.
And I'm Marcella Salgado.
And this is Who Killed Jesus, a true crime podcast, episode 6.5, a follow-up. So friends, we did this podcast throughout Lent as a way we hope to help you think about the book we were reading in small groups called The Last Week by Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan, but also as a way for all of us to understand a little bit better the events of Holy Week, at least as described in the Gospel of Mark. And so we knew that there were some lingering questions about the book and about the podcast, and so we thought it might be kind of fun on this Sunday after Easter to do a podcast-style sermon together. Does that sound good, Marcella?
It sounds good.
Okay, you all up for that too? Okay, good. We'll keep it pretty short, but we want to address some of the questions. So just a reminder of what happened during the events of Holy Week. So it begins on Palm Sunday, where in the Gospel of Mark, we see Jesus entering on one side of town and Pontius Pilate on the other side of town. And Jesus stages a kind of anti-imperial protest, a parade that marks a difference between the imperialism of Rome. Instead, we see loyalty to the reign of God that is made manifest through the actions of justice and peace. Then on Holy Monday, Jesus and his disciples go into the temple, and as an affront to the purity system that divided people into social classes, and as a way to call out the religious leaders who were colluding with Rome, those who were complicit with Roman power, they staged this anti-temple protest where Jesus overturns the money changers' tables. Then on what we dubbed Teaching Tuesday, Jesus goes out into the courtyard and he gives some more parables, teachings that act as kind of an affront to the religious establishment. Then on what we called Woman's Wednesday, a woman anoints Jesus' head in the home of a leper. So a marginalized person names Jesus as the clearest manifestation of God in the home of someone who is ritually impure. Maundy Thursday, we're familiar with. Jesus has a meal with his disciples, likely a Passover meal, but different than the Passover meals that we know today. If you'd like to read more about that, you might check out a scholar named Mike Graves' book called Table Talk. And on Good Friday, Jesus is crucified for sedition. Silent Saturday, we get silence from Jesus. And Traditionally, that's called the harrowing of hell, but as we talked about in the podcast, that's a later development that Jesus likely didn't believe in hell, and he didn't use that word. He used the word Gehenna in the New Testament. And then on Easter Sunday, we see the women going to anoint the body in the tomb and discovering an empty tomb. And in Mark's Gospel, the original version does not include the verses we just heard, but ends with the women running away scared. So that is a quick and dirty rundown of what happened during Holy Week. And Marcella, we gathered 16 suspects on our board.
Right here, yes, our 16 suspects, which we talked about every week during the podcast, but just to remind everybody, first up we have the Roman Empire. Of course, they were the ones in control. They were the government of the time. We have Pilate, who had come in to just watch what was happening during the time of Passover, which was a tradition that he had. They would always come in and make sure that people wouldn't uprise during that time and during their celebrations. The Sanhedrin, which we know is like a Jewish council, and so there were some of the Jewish leaders made up of some of the religious leaders and some of the very wealthy families of the time. Jews, of course, we hear that a lot. The Jews get blamed for being the ones who crucified Jesus. Sadducees and Pharisees, which were two religious leaders, groups of leaders at the time, and they were the ones that Jesus went back and forth with on Teaching Tuesday. We also have original sin. So we've heard this a lot, right? Original sin, Adam and Eve. If that had never happened, then there would be no reason for the cross. We have God, which ties into original sin. It was God's plan for Jesus to die, right? Then we also had a suggestion, the Republican Party, which continues to crucify Jesus today. And Caleb had brought up just U.S. politics in general. My personal favorite, my personal sin, the sin of, I was just born a sinful creature, you were born a sinful creature, and hence that is why Jesus had to die on the cross. Then we also had a lovely suggestion by somebody I love, that Courtney Love had something to do with Jesus' death. We threw it in there because Marcella is adamant that they need to reopen Kurt Cobain's murder case and really look into other suspects. Then, of course, Judas. We know the story of Judas, who betrayed Jesus and told them where Jesus was going to be the night that he was arrested. We also have greed, which also ties into Judas, but our own greed, Judas's greed, he might be symbolic of the greed. He wanted money, some suggest. And then the disciples. We don't hear that one a lot, but it is very much worth thinking about the disciples. Where were they during all of this? And Caiaphas, which is also a name you don't hear very often, but Caiaphas was one of the leaders at the time. And then the Roman Emperor Tiberius, which ties back into the Roman Empire as a whole. So where did we land with?
Yeah, that's a lot of suspects to talk about. And to be fair, most of these we didn't come up with ourselves. We threw this out on social media and said, who do you think killed Jesus? And we got a lot of, well, it's very clear who killed Jesus. Why are you even talking about this? And then they went on to list something different than the person in the comment ahead of them, right, who had said something similar. So it's interesting because people have a lot of very strongly held beliefs about this. And so we went through and over the course of the podcast talked about why each of these forces may or may not have been at play. But where we landed was that crucifixion is a Roman form of death, right? And so it was Pontius Pilate on behalf of Emperor Tiberius and the empire with the complicity of those who were colluding with Rome. And I think, Marcella, that's something that I learned maybe in a renewed way, talking about this again, was that there were people who were in either religious or political local authority who had a lot at stake in staying in power but they were also in a difficult position.
Very difficult position. They were, especially like a lot of the Jewish leaders were trying to toe that line where they wanted to protect the Jewish community, and you kind of had to play the game also with and go along with Rome and what Rome wanted, and that's keeping the peace, make sure people weren't going to uprise, weren't going to ruffle any feathers.
So there was part of wanting to stay in power, and there was part of wanting to protect the people, and it was a delicate balance. And so people like Caiaphas, the high priest, had a really tight rope that they had to walk, a really fine line they had to walk, or else if they made the Romans too mad, it might not just be one person who was crucified, it might be a whole group of people.
Yeah, definitely.
I think it's important to say, though, that this whole notion that it was the Jews who crucified Jesus is completely unfounded. I mean, as we talked about, Jesus and all of his early followers were Jewish. So it wasn't the Jews who crucified Jesus. And the whole notion that the Jews could force the Romans to do anything is actually really ludicrous. I mean, an oppressed people telling the empire what to do is ridiculous. But that's the thing that I got most on social media was like, well, it's the Jewish people crucified Jesus. And that's historically inaccurate, and it has led to centuries of anti-Semitism. But I think it's also important to say that one of the reasons for that is because the Gospel of John, which was written like 60 years or more after Jesus' crucifixion, was written at a time where the early Christian community was leaving the synagogue. And so the Gospel of John loses the distinction between those groups you were talking about, Marcella, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and lumps everybody together because at that point in time, Christianity was developing as a separate movement, but that wasn't original to the intent.
Very good.
So I think it's important to draw out that distinction. What do you think about the notion of, say, original sin?
Oh, well, I mean, I don't believe in it. So I think that is something that I grew up hearing a lot. I think it's what a lot of churches still continue to preach, that we are born into sinful nature, and that's also unfounded. Like, God made us beautiful. Like, we hear over and over again that, God created us beautiful and wonderful. Do I believe that evil exists? Of course. We are all capable of being hurtful and evil. We are all capable of probably the most heinous of crimes. I am a true crime podcast junkie. Yes. And part of that is that fascination that we are all capable of evil. But original sin, no, I don't understand it. Why would God, and then also why would God need to redeem us by killing God's own son? Like, none of that makes sense to me.
Yeah, and I think it's important. This is one of the things that I think really illustrates why it's important to know how theology developed, because if Jesus were hanging on the cross and someone came up to him and said, "Thank you for dying for the sins of Adam so that I'm not marred by original sin," he would have no idea what you were talking about because that idea hadn't been invented yet. It wasn't invented for centuries until Augustine came through and read that back into it. So I think it's important to know the history of theology because, if you choose to believe those things, you can choose to believe whatever you want. But I think that it's important to know that Jesus wouldn't have even heard of that concept.
Well, and I think tied into that is also this idea of the cross. We have crosses as symbols, and we wear them, and it is a symbol of something that was important, an important event, right, for us as Christians. But the cross at the time was Rome's form of executing anybody who stood up against government. So a thief would not have been crucified on a cross. They would have been killed in a different manner. The cross was a very clear sign that somebody was standing up against empire and speaking up against the government. So Jesus dying on the cross was a very clear way of them saying, this person's ruffling feathers, this person is questioning us, and this person is going to cause a revolution. There was fear in that. So I think that's an important point to remember too. Going back to, Jesus hanging on the cross for our sins, it was very clearly an execution because of what he was saying and because of the followers he had.
That's a good point, Marcella. And I think one thing that I forgot or didn't think about a lot was that the Romans would leave the vertical posts outside of cities and as a sign that if you spoke out against Rome, that you could be crucified. And sometimes when you would go into the city, you would see people hanging on the cross there as a visual reminder. But even if there weren't people hanging on the cross, the vertical pole was still there, and people would carry the cross beam, the horizontal beam, to the cross to be crucified. So I think the other notion that's tied into that is the whole thought of Jesus dying for sins. So you said you don't like the idea of original sin. How do you feel about the idea of Jesus dying for personal sin? Because you said that was something you heard a lot growing up, was that Jesus died for your personal sin.
Yes, I did hear that a lot. And in the book that we read the last week, there was some better explanation for that. I mean, I had let go of that theology when I was I think before I hit college, but in college as I was studying and learning from my professors, I learned to let go of that because of just learning the historical evolution of Christianity and how that idea was brought in later. But they describe it in the book that, even this idea, we try to equate it as like, back in the Old Testament times, the Jewish community had to sacrifice a lamb or sacrifice a dove or some sort of animal. And so Jesus is that ultimate sacrifice. And Borg and Crossan explained that that's not so. You would explain it so much better than I would, because I will take 20 minutes.
Well, so I think the important thing to realize is that there are multiple theologies presented in the Gospels. And I think Borg and Crossan acknowledged that atonement is one theology that is presented in the Bible, but not the only theology that's presented in the Bible. And it seems to have been a later development and not what Jesus was actually originally theologically doing. Or at least I think we can say that it's clear that Jesus was crucified by the Roman Empire for speaking an anti-imperial message. That's the only reason that Romans crucified people. The only reason. The Jewish leaders didn't put Jesus to death because if they had, it would have been death by stoning and not crucifixion. So any theologizing beyond Jesus standing up to empire is something that people were doing after his death to make sense of it themselves. So it's not a theology that Jesus gave, it is a theology that his followers gave afterward. So if you believe that, I think it's important to come to terms with the fact that that's not something that Jesus gave, but it's an interpretation that followers gave.
Yeah.
So with that, I think we should take just a really quick break, and we'll come back and we'll talk about what this means theologically for us today.
Who Killed Jesus? A true crime podcast was a special 6-week exploration of who really killed Jesus and why.
This podcast was brought to you by ProgressiveChristianity.org, celebrating 30 years of reclaiming Jesus' original message of justice, peace, and liberation while proclaiming an intellectually honest Christianity.
And University Christian Church, San Diego, an authentic, inclusive, and progressive congregation in the heart of San Diego's Hillcrest neighborhood that declares God's love for all people.
So we did ask about some lingering questions, and I think 2 lingering questions that came up from small group leaders that we heard about was, one, a follow-up on what we were just talking about. Did Jesus die for our sins? And what does that mean theologically? And is Jesus divine? And I think those are 2 questions that small groups were really wrestling with. And different small groups came out to different answers, I think. And so, the whole notion of Jesus dying for our sins, I think I grew up, Marcella, not really questioning that very much. Yeah. That was just something that I heard in church. And I grew up in a progressive church, but I heard the language of that in the liturgy, and it was in the water that I drank in rural Missouri. It just was something that people believed. But the more that I studied it, the more I realized that idea probably developed later. And for me, that was transformative, because instead of focusing then on belief about Jesus, it shifted my focus to following the message of Jesus. Mm-hmm. Instead of believing the right things about him, trying to live my life emulating him.
Right. Very similar to you. Same. Grew up in Colorado Springs, which is like the heart of conservative Christianity these days. And same idea, like grew up really learning, but also feeling that, geez, no matter what I did, I was sinful. I always had to pray to make sure I was forgiven for all my sins and all these little nitpicky things. And it really led to me questioning, like there was a lot of piety, like just a lot of religious piety. Do this, don't do that, don't do that, don't do this. I was raised with very progressive parents, a progressive theologian that my dad is, but the church was very, very different. And it just never made sense to me. But then once I started studying, there was something that came up in my mind where dying for my sins feels good, right? It feels good in the sense of like, Jesus, you died for me to save me, because I'm a creature that needs saving. But it is much harder to step into the role of following Jesus the way that Jesus asks us to do. It is much harder to do justice and to love, like undoubtedly loving our enemies is much more difficult. It's great for me to think that somebody died for me to make me feel good, to make me look good, to make me, this great creature, but it is much harder to really step into a role of justice. And that's where I land now, where following Jesus is hard because we're complicit day after day, especially living in a country like the United States. We are complicit in a lot of what we do. With the clothes that we wear, who's making that clothes? What children are making that clothes? With the stuff that we throw away, with, like putting up a sign that says Black Lives Matter and going out to those marches is very hard because we know we're gonna be, face challenges. That is much harder than to sit down and just thank you, Jesus, for dying for my sins and making it all about me and a personal relationship with Jesus. So that's kind of where I've landed, and I don't know.
And I think maybe at this point, it's important to say that, in our tradition, we believe in something called a responsible freedom of belief. And so sometimes people get a little bit confused about that, and they say, oh, well, you can believe whatever you want. And that's not actually true. We believe in a responsible freedom of belief. And so what that means is like a belief that's willing to dialogue, that's willing to discuss. And so I think no matter where you come out on some of these issues, it's okay to come out in different places. One of the things that I appreciate about this tradition is a willingness to be able to converse and discuss different ways that we might think about these things. Because the other truth of the matter is that both to that question and to this next one, that the Gospels present different ideas. Mm-hmm. And so the next question is Jesus divine? And I bet if I went and did a survey of people in the congregation, we would land all over the place.
All over the
on
place,
this.
Undoubtedly.
And that's okay. That's okay, because we have a responsible freedom of belief. And so I would say that in the Gospel of Mark, which we were reading for this podcast, that in the Gospel of Mark, we have a very low Christology. So Christology is how divine you think Jesus is. Because I don't think the author of the Gospel of Mark thought that Jesus was divine. But the author of the Gospel of John, I think, did think Jesus was divine. Yeah. And so I think you get different opinions about that in the Gospel. And I think we probably get different opinions about that here. And so I think that it's okay to land in different places. I think it just can't affect how we live our lives. I think that ultimately Jesus' message at the end of the day, whether you think he was just fully human, whether you think he was fully divine, whether you think he was fully human, fully divine, because Christians have always been all over the map on that, right?
Yeah.
There were Jewish Christian adoptionists who thought Jesus was just a person, and there were Marcionite Christians who thought Jesus was so divine he only appeared to be here. Okay, so people have always been all over the map on that. But I think no matter where we land, it's important to do those things that Marcella was just talking about, which is living our lives in a way that emulates the life of Jesus.
I have a quick question, though.
Yeah.
In 30 seconds, Caleb. If somebody considers Jesus not divine,
Yeah.
what makes him so special? Does that change our Christianity? If Jesus is not divine,
Yeah.
what does that mean for us as Christians and Christianity as a whole? Because isn't the whole premise of Christianity that Jesus was divine? That's just a question.
Yeah, so, I mean, this is something that I hear a whole lot, especially in social media. And no, I don't think that the whole premise of Christianity is that Jesus was divine. I actually don't think that Jesus taught that. So you may have heard this before, but I think that after Jesus died, there was a fundamental switch from the religion of Jesus to the religion about Jesus. That Jesus talked primarily about the creation of the reign of God on earth, and then his disciples in turn talked primarily about him. And so when you get that movement, then there is a focus on Jesus. Now, I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with that. I think that what makes it what marks us, I suppose, as true Jesus followers is not actually what we believe. So there's so much about orthodoxy in Christianity, believing the right thing. But I think perhaps there should be more focus on orthopraxy, which is doing the right thing, living our lives as modeled by Jesus, which we can easily see, right? Loving our neighbor, practicing radical inclusion, opening the table, fighting for justice on behalf of those who are marginalized. That those are the things that Jesus talked about and did in his life. At the end of the day, I think that whether you believe Jesus is divine or not is not nearly as important as how you live your life.
I agree. I fully agree. And this goes back to, as somebody who grew up in a very different denomination, there is a reason why I chose Disciples of Christ, and I'm glad that we're also part of the United Church of Christ. But here at University Christian Church, I intentionally wanted to join the Disciples of Christ because of the broad range of views, but also the acceptance and the dialogue that happens before the church denomination as a whole makes decisions. We have these conversations, and there are clergy members having these conversations, and we allow our congregations to have these ideas. And I think that's a really beautiful thing, because I was tired of being told what to believe.
And so in the same way that Marcella and I both have very low Christologies, that we thank you for putting up with us and allowing us to, extending us the grace to have those low theologies, as I'm sure some of you have much higher Christologies, and that's all fine to exist in the same space. That's one of the beautiful things about this tradition, is that we're all able to be in it together. I think one more thing to say, and then we ought to wrap up, because you and I love to talk about this stuff and would for a long time, is that the original ending of the Gospel of Mark is the ending that we heard last week, where there isn't an interpretation given to the empty tomb. And later editors came through and added the stuff that we heard today, where we see Jesus and get some post-Easter stories. I really like the original ending to the Gospel of Mark because we don't get an answer. And I know that like a lot of religion has served to like give us answers, but at least for me, religion is more meaningful when it helps us to live the questions than when it gives us easy answers. Because then the question becomes, where is Jesus? And as I said last week, I think we then get to answer with our lives. that we get to demonstrate where Jesus is. And if you come up with a different answer than that, then that's fine too. If you say, actually, I like this added stuff to Mark, or you say, actually, Mark's not the gospel for me, I really like John. Well, that's all fine too. But I think it's important to recognize that Mark's the earliest gospel, and so I think we get the earliest version of theology of resurrection in the Gospel of Mark.
I agree.
Yeah. Any final thoughts, Marcella?
No, just thank you for going on this journey with us. I learned a lot. I know that a bunch of you also had great dialogue, and we appreciate letting you, or entertaining us, allowing us to do this podcast during the past 6 weeks.
Thank you, Marcella. I had a great time. It was
Me
a lot of
too.
fun.
It
Thank you
was.
all.
It was.